Hello and welcome to Newspeak, our weekly look at the news agenda. As usual, I'm very pleased to say we're joined by Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, Senior Fellow and Royal Historian, Amy Gallagher of Stand Up to Woke, and Dr. Philip Kiszely, also Senior Fellow and from Leeds University. Now, before we do discuss some pretty important events this week, of course, we've got some news about our ever-expanding locals programme. Over to you, Rafe.
Right, so we've been off to a great start this month, so thanks to everyone who's come out already to our locals events in Wellingborough, Hull and Bath. But fear not, we're coming to a town near you soon, I'm sure. The rest of September, if you live near any of these towns, do drop us a line at locals@newcultureforum.org.uk if you would like to attend in Brighton on in Reading on the 17th of September, in Newcastle on the 17th of September, in Edinburgh on the 18th, that's a Wednesday, in Carlisle on the 22nd, which is a Sunday. We'll be in Sheffield on the 24th, which is a Tuesday, and in Beaconsfield on the 26th. Norwich will see us on the 29th of September, and also just come in 3 more events, the 19th of September in Canterbury, and on the 28th, we will be both in London and in Liverpool. These events are all free of charge, a great occasion to come together and meet kindred spirits in a safe space. And also there'll be a couple of guest speakers at some of these events. So do drop us an email, locals@newcultureforum.org.uk.
Thanks very much, Rafe. This is extraordinarily important. I know we're always saying this, but I think particularly now that the way this government is shaping up as well, people need to have an outlet and actually to get active. And no one else is doing it in the way that we are. Anyway, enough of the self-congratulation. Let's bring ourselves back down to earth. Our wonderful Mayor of London, Philip, has come up with a really great plan, hasn't he?
Well, he's good at this, isn't he? He comes up with all of these crazy ideas, and each one is crazier than the next. So this is about prioritising prisoners. We've got, at the moment, I think we've got 1,700 people who are just leaving prison or who have just left prison. And Sadiq Khan wants to prioritise these people and get them to the top of the housing list. Now, this reminds me, actually, of a story that I've just spoken about English heritage. That it's exactly the same principle, isn't it? So the story was, and I spoke about it yesterday on the television, that refugees go to our great country houses for free, and everybody else, including pensioners, have to pay. This is exactly the same principle. This is the people who are least worthy, who need things, they are at least worthy. They are put to the top of the waiting list, and everybody else, people who contribute to society, people who abide by the law, become second-class citizens. Now, we keep saying we've got two-tier policing, but of course we've got two-tier everything. And when it comes to something so fundamental as housing, and so fundamental as housing in London, where quite simply there isn't any, then it becomes extremely worrying and extremely dangerous. But it isn't just the response. This is a response to the crazy idea of bringing all of these felons out, isn't it? It's the actual idea itself, isn't it? The idea that we are going to bring all of these massively dangerous people into society because we need to make spaces in prisons for people who are disgruntled about immigration and have gone over the top on social media.
Yeah. Very well put. I mean, who the hell does he think he's going to be appealing to with this?
Well, it's always remarkable with Sadiq Khan, because we always say this every mayoral election, who the hell is voting for Sadiq Khan? But people do. There is this kind of left-leaning metropolitan elite in London that really back these policies, which is, it's crazy. But I mean, he's absolutely fouled on all of his housing policies. He had loads of policies around building more houses. It's come nowhere near building the amount of houses he said he would. And we also know that 48% of social housing goes to people that weren't born in Britain in London. So there's already this housing crisis going on. So this just adds insult to injury to say that housing will now go to prisoners, because it really is punishing the innocent and rewarding the guilty, essentially. And it is essentially rewarding bad behaviour, so that people that have been to prison will be given housing over people that haven't. So it's totally topsy-turvy.
Did you see, actually, some of the people coming out and being filmed at the prison? I mean, it's quite remarkable.
Champagne corks popping, a £200,000 Lamborghini pulling up so some drug dealer could get into his mate's car and drive off. You asked, who's going to be voting for this? Well, one of them said, I'm now a lifelong Labour voter, having been let out early. I mean, Amy's quite correct. This is rewarding criminality. Also with what Philip said, rewarding illegal immigrants. So the messaging here is if you break the law, whether you're an illegal immigrant or you're a criminal, you will get to jump the queue. And nothing offends the British more than queue jumping. And the messaging behind this is just really clear, and it absolutely stinks. I mean, if you want to, you're essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul in a sense, because you're allegedly freeing up the prisons, but at the same time you're then filling up the available housing accommodation. And we know already how many British people who have been on housing waiting lists for months, if not years, have seen in their own locality brand new apartment buildings built and then immediately filled with refugees. And I think in London 76% of Somalis live in social housing and so forth. I mean, it's absolutely disgraceful, and it's a betrayal of people who have had roots here for generations. If you want to actually solve the prison crisis, there are 10,000 prisoners of foreign extraction in our prisons. Free up those 10,000 spaces by sending them back, deporting them, and you wouldn't need to have any of this. But of course, the Labour government will never countenance that.
Yeah, but what have people got against building more prisons? I don't get it. The Tories didn't either. Why can't you build more prisons? I mean,
isn't that what Ebenezer Scrooge said in A Christmas Carol?
Is it?
That's the very spirit of us here.
It's very similar to the housing crisis in that there's a real issue with prisons in terms of supply and demand, in that prisoners, the amount of prisoners or the amount of people committing crime has gone up, but building of prisons hasn't, and there's a real capacity issue.
This general problem with housing, actually, you mentioned that, is it would take one change to completely transform the situation. Social housing used to be that you were on the list, right, and you were rooted in that area, and it was changed to of the greatest need. Yeah. So, of course, if you come from Somalia with 5 kids, you've actually got the greatest need.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the point very briefly about prisons and prisoners coming out, we've seen already today, we're recording this on Friday, this is going out on the Saturday, that some of the prisoners have already breached their conditions and they're going back in already. Who'd have thought, eh? Who'd have thought? But yes, it's that vague general want. We're doing good. It's the people who need it the most. We are the good people. We are the good guys here. And if you balk at this for some reason, then you're wicked and evil, even though you've lived here all your life, your family have lived here all your life, and you've paid into the system all your life, and it just so happens that you need something. Well, guess what? You're not going to get it because the people who came here yesterday trump your needs.
And of course, the fundamental principle of the social housing system was to keep communities, keep families intact. And of course, we've seen a fraying of the social fabric in our society. You can no longer rely on your parents to look after their grandchildren because you're living 300 miles away, as an example, as a result of that. So what is the greatest priority? We speak about greatest need. I would argue the greatest need is to keep communities intact and to preserve, social. That's a very fundamental aspect of social life and the social fabric. But yeah, on the broader point, the type of people also who are going to be housed are the very worst types of offenders. People who actually have been, wife beaters, child abusers, people who've committed what we would call murder, but they've been in prison for manslaughter, so long as that sentence is less than 4 years. So there was one chap, Natty, his name was, who killed some teenager with a machete that he bought. He got less than 4 years. He's now out. Now imagine how you feel if you were the family of such a person, or imagine if you're an abused wife. And your ex-lover is now out on the streets, having served, in one case, only 1 month out of an 18-month sentence. I mean, there's absolutely no justification for that. And then, of course, why are they being vacated? Because of a 55-year-old carer, never in trouble with the law, who posted something on Facebook, and she's now taking up that space. I would have thought that's the person you want to release because they've had the fright of their life by being arrested and by being convicted. They will never stray off the path again, and you know that they're not going to reoffend or be any threat.
Indeed.
The thing is what's interesting about this is that this is actually what kind of the old communist regimes used to do. They would kind of not look after the prisoners, but I mean, basically sort of crime as such was sort of almost abolished, wasn't it, in a way? But it was, criminality of thought, which they were really, really hot on. And we see this with some. I mean, when you just got to look at the man in a way, he's a solid, cold bureaucrat and a prosecutor, isn't he?
Yeah, and when I've seen interviews with him where he's essentially talked about in the past about prisoners that were on death row and how he had great sympathy for them and how he met with them and how he had tried to get them off. And it seems to be the only group of people that he has real compassion for. Yeah. I think it is something about that leftist kind of mindset that the people that commit the most crime, they're kind of victims of the capitalist society more than anybody else because of their behaviour. They don't ever attribute anything to personal responsibility. They attribute everything to something's been done to you as to why you're like this. So it now raises the criminal as the most, the victimised person that needs all the help more than anybody else. And it's totally deranged.
Yes, it's classic socialism, but also there's an opportunity here for them as well, isn't there? I mean, to build more prisons for real criminals is to suggest that they're losing, to suggest that their policies aren't working, but to demonize and isolate people like Rafe's just mentioned, who are essentially political prisoners now. That's a boon for them, that they want to do as much as that as they can possibly do. So again, with socialism and with this particular view of the world, everything is, as Amy says, topsy-turvy, upside down. And ultimately, it's ordinary people who really suffer here.
Yeah, is that one point actually, because they are related, this whole idea of social housing, and obviously we started off with Sadiq Khan in London, didn't we? This whole idea of basically you shouldn't let communities sort of fray at the edges, and it might actually be hard now to have this rule, in London at least, of if you've been here for 4 or 5 years or whatever, you should take precedence if your roots are in this area. Because all of our areas are now transitory. The only ones that aren't transitory are what I would call pretty rich upper middle class places like Richmond. But if you're talking about all the places, they don't exactly need social housing there, do they? If you talk about all the other places, it's like come and go,
It's why we use this word community, isn't it? Because community is a nebulous kind of thing, which might be based on colour, it might be based on gender, it might be based on all sorts of different kinds of things. Well, you're talking about a particular place, and there's a difference between neighbourhoods and communities. And I just refuse to think in terms of communities anymore because the word is so tainted. I'm much more interested in neighbourhoods because that really should be about stability. And that's really what we should be thinking about rather than communities, I would suggest.
Well, I would just say you do have a pretty static population. If you go to East London, the Bangladeshi community is pretty static there. South East London, a lot of Africans there and so forth. So you do have parts of the country where actually they do have roots of quite a few number of years.
Yes, of course, but the roots actually came about because of the housing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, there was a mass movement out of the kind of white Cockney, if you can even talk in those terms, wasn't there?
And I would call those places neighbourhoods as well, because I think they are.
Or ghettos, I would.
Well, yes, but they're very well established.
Yeah. Also, just on this point of basically the fraying of the social fabric, I'd be frivolous here, but this might be one of the reasons as well why, fewer and fewer people are actually paying their TV license.
Yeah.
Think about it. It was something where people would come round to remind you. It relied on a kind of sense of permanence. How could you enforce this thing such as a BBC licence in an area, I don't know, like not just Hackney, but Tower Hamlets or actually anywhere at Lewisham?
I've heard people describe London as a kind of an economic zone where people just use it to get resources from and then get out as quickly as possible as they can. Just, take what you can and then from it and then leave. There is no sense of community. So I feel like, and I mean, all these prisoners being released, it's almost as though the government have forgotten what prison's even about. It should be primarily about protecting the public, but there doesn't seem to be any consideration for that. I mean, we already reduced sentences by half anyway, so there's an idea, well, why not reduce them more? And then it just becomes complete anarchy. Yeah. There is this idea of it, and anything can go. And so TV licenses, I guess that's right down the bottom. I mean,
it's probably the only good thing to come out of it. Actually, isn't it?
Yes, every cloud, etc. On this point, we're talking broadly about refugees. We're talking about these areas. There has been something could be seismic happening, Rafe, this week when it comes to the EU. I'll let you explain, but basically, are we seeing the end of the Schengen agreement?
Well, very possibly. It could have certainly happened. So the German government, which I would remind you is a centre-left government led by a chancellor from the Social Democratic Party, has now said that there's going to be a temporary pause on the Schengen, on its borders. So it's essentially closing off all of its borderlands, including with, the Netherlands, Western Europe and so forth, for 6 months. That's because to have a permanent closure, you need to have the permission of the EU to do it. And this is because, of course, they have realized that the rise of the right, the rise of those who see immigration as the disaster that it is, are posing an existential crisis to the legacy mainstream parties. They've seen the AfD rise in places like Thuringia and Saxony and so forth, and they're trying to fight against that. At the same time that they've had a series of events happening in Germany of a stabbing in an affair where people were killed, and a whole series of these types of events that have coalesced people around the whole realization of what a danger they threat if this is left unattended. At the same time as this, they're also giving permission now for German border control to actually reject refugees and migrants outright. And they're also now considering the Rwanda scheme. They've got their own version of Rwanda. At the same time, we've just actually also had Sweden has just announced a voluntary repatriation scheme whereby they will be paying not just refugees, but naturalised citizens, people who are actually naturalised, 30,000 euros or so Swedish krona to go back to their homelands. And if you are a family of 5, that's 30,000 each. You could have a very nice, comfortable lifestyle if you go back to, I don't know, Lesotho or wherever you're from. So this is, this exposes the nonsense arguments of the left in this country. Because what is Keir Starmer going to say? Is he going to say that ultra-liberal Sweden and the German Social Democrat, that they far right now? I mean, it really reveals the complete the cognitive dissonance between the left in this country and the left in Europe, who really see it as it is. And still, people in this country view the EU as somehow being the most sort of placid, welcoming place for immigrants. And I think it's a wake-up call that the left needs to understand and realize, because it's going to happen in this country sooner rather than later. Yeah. It's just, I would say, one of the great problems here, as I said before, is the fact that we here, we had the big riots and the protests, and it was unfortunately on a false prospectus. We could have had similar things happening here had we followed the German example of people's reaction to the stabbings that we saw there.
Yeah, it's this is actually this new ruling, or the new rules will be as of this Monday, I believe, right? But it's sort of been happening by default anyway with Hungary, hasn't it? And Austria, it's sort of like the whole thing is crumbling, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the really annoying thing about it, more than annoying, it's quite devastating really, is that these people, the people in charge, the woke leaders, they only act when there have been an amount of atrocities, when violent and sexual crime is pretty much out of control, and the whole social contract is just falling apart. It's only after all of those things happen, and there's an element of political expediency to it all, that they will then say, oh, we need to do this and we need to do that. And I was just thinking about this because we were reading about these things today, and I was thinking about here, and I was thinking about the next stage in our development over the next 2 or 3 years. How low do we have to go? What kind of crisis do we have to meet before we start saying, as we will do, we'll have to do, oh, well, we need to be doing this, we need to be doing that, we need to be offering possible voluntary repatriation. The tragedy is that we have to look into the abyss before it can happen.
It is quite extraordinary. I mean, even something like a country like Sweden, which was the kind of benchmark of liberal kind of social progressivism and all of that, is talking about voluntary repatriation. I mean, it is quite extraordinary.
I do remember, though, of course, it was established Conservative Party policy in this country in the 1970s to have repatriation and so forth. Yet somehow, if you raise that concept today in this country, you are automatically deemed as beyond the pale. But I think the fact that countries in Europe are entertaining this notion will mean that we can actually have those discussions over here now. I think that's the great thing here. People, the left here can no longer say this is beyond the pale when you have left-wing governments in Europe entertaining that. And of course, in Denmark as well, former trade union prime minister who said we want to have 0 refugees in this country.
It does seem to be that only a kind of anti-immigration laws or policies can only be brought in by left-wing governments, because they can do it without being called bigots or racist, and it kind of happens kind of quietly under the radar, whereas if it was a right-wing government it would be, outrage. But we have to remind ourselves that this is off the back of the rise of the AfD, the right-wing Alliance for Germany party that have won some recent regional elections. So it's almost like the left almost have to respond to this problem, not because they're worried about, as Phillips was saying, people losing their lives, but because they're worried about votes. It's very cynical in that sense. And I do think this recent stabbing in Germany, where 3 people were stabbed by an asylum seeker at a festival of diversity, and it's like you couldn't make it up. It does feel to me like almost a slight tipping point. I know I'm always cautious about using the phrase tipping point, but it did feel to kind of have the kind of absolute farce of immigration and diversity and multiculturalism kind of just shown for what it was, that this festival was so diverse that it included stabbings. And I think it almost represented the disillusionment that everyone on the right and the left are experiencing around immigration. So it does feel like this is a turning point in Europe, I think. And if, with these laws policies that Germany are bringing in, it might have a domino effect in that all the other European countries will have to become stricter with their borders in response to Germany. So it is very interesting to see, actually.
Actually, you talk about cynicism. I've seen comments to the effect that some of this might be performative anyway, that in fact, the guards who are carrying out the checks and everything are going to be pretty casual about it. It's just to be seen to be doing something about it, which I think is appalling. But yes, it is getting harder and harder for our dear friends who still whine away on Twitter, about, Remainer friends and all the rest. It's getting harder and harder, isn't it, for them to actually, even justify the whole idea, that this is the very thing. Speaking of cynicism, you just said there, the left can actually talk about it in the way the right can't. That really goes for the NHS, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's been proven this week. There's been now. What was the name of the report? Actually,
a report by Lord Darcy, who's a surgeon, a member of the House of Lords. So he was commissioned to do a report into the NHS as soon as they got into power. So what was it, 9 weeks ago or something, by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. And Keir Starmer came out this week and spoke about this report and said it showed, well, most of us already know, that the NHS is in crisis. And there's some kind of useful, interesting statistics that around 14,000 people die every year because of A&E waiting lists not being met and so on. But what was interesting was that Keir Starmer essentially, very soon into his prime ministership, has come out and said he doesn't want to spend any more money in the NHS until there is reform. Now, you just think if the Tories had come out and said this, it would have been a complete outrage. I mean, the Tories for the last 14 years have had this kind of smear of Tory cuts in relation to the NHS, which is a complete myth. They put more and more money into the NHS in order to win people's approval and to be considered the party of the NHS, which I don't think really did them any good. I think it's still ingrained in people's minds that there are Tory cuts to the NHS. I don't think we're ever going to get over that kind of slogan. But Keir Starmer's come out and said that he's not putting any more money until there is reform. So it's very, I mean, firstly, it's interesting that he's even using the word reform, because he's, it's obviously we have now a political party who are called Reform. So when sometimes you hear it, you think, is he calling for Nigel Farage to come in and sort something out? But of course, that writ large, most of us, I think, would agree with that there does need to be reform rather than pumping money into the NHS. But the thing is, the kind of reform that he is calling for, not surprisingly, is not the sort of reform that we would want. It's very interesting in that there's been an emphasis on, with this report, what Keir Starmer was saying, in prevention, so preventing illness or ill health rather than treating it. So, of course, the emphasis is turned on the public, that there needs to be this new kind of nanny state that restricts advertising of junk food, that makes sure children are supervised when they're brushing their teeth, that we need to have a change our diets, that they of course they want to bring in the smoking ban. So it's all about the public is to blame for the crisis of the NHS, where of course most of us know, as we've talked about on this show, and none of this is being spoken about by the Labour government, that 500 million a year is spent on diversity, equity, inclusion.
500 million?
Yeah, on roles that are related to DEI, kind of equality roles. We know that 2 billion a year is spent on foreign health tourism and overseas visitors that come in that have only lived in this country for 6 months or a year, that haven't paid into the tax system, that will use the NHS system. We know that about hundreds of millions is spent on wasted appointments, people that just use and abuse the NHS. They book appointments, they don't cancel, they just use it like they can do anything to it. We know that tens of millions is spent on interpreters for patients that don't speak English. There's so much waste, and millions is spent on managerial roles and bureaucratic roles that just make nurses and doctors' lives harder. None of that is being spoken about by Keir Starmer. It's all about the public need to change. And it reminds me of the approach to COVID, was that it was our job to save the NHS rather than that the NHS system needs to be changed.
Yeah. It's extraordinary, actually, that, when you think it was not that long ago, it's almost like a pride before a fall, isn't it? Everyone was out there banging their cups and pots and pans.
It was so informative, wasn't it? I used to live in an extremely liberal area, and everybody was banging maniacally.
You mean you live in a nasty right-wing one now?
I've tried to move to one, yeah. Maniacally banging with pots and pans, and if you didn't join in, then you were immediately ostracised. Amy there just talking about budgets is a really interesting one. I'd love to know how much they've spent on rainbow lanyards. Surely that would have saved one or two lives.
Isn't this the problem in a way? Actually, it's the problem in a way that when you come to reform of anything to the NHS, the most hostility and the most opposition will come from the NHS.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish the point, there's a sense that the NHS comes before anything. It certainly comes before kind of saving lives and health. It's about what socialism is about, isn't it? And so we look at the NHS and we can't do anything about it. It was designed in the pre-war era for a different country. It was a country that was cohesive in terms of society and a country that worked. Britain 2024 is a very different place, and yet we cannot change this model because the report will just be swept under the carpet. There'll be a few days, and the emphasis, as Amy says, will be put on the general public, and then things will just carry on as normal. And the fact that junior doctors and medical professionals generally have held the Tories with a gun to their head for the last 15 years will just be completely forgotten.
Actually, West Streeting, he referred to Britain as being, we don't want to be a small country, an NHS with a small country attached. Right. Now, that's the sort of thing, I think Alison Pearson coined that phrase.
And The Spectator.
I mean, arch radical Alison Pearson. But that's how it sometimes feels, isn't it?
Well,
how many people are employed by the NHS?
Alison Pearson said that 6 years ago, and spending has gone up by 20% in those last 6 years on the NHS. And, you have to give West Streeting his due. I think he understands that what's going on here. He may well have commissioned this report in order to wake up the Labour Party for whom this is a sacred cow. I mean, Amy's correct. I mean, the amount of wastage that's going on. But as you said, there are vested interests. So, they have, machines and that can now do surgery 5 times faster than surgeons can do it. And Sajid Javid asked them, well, why hasn't this been rolled out? He said, well, opposition from surgeons who don't want this to be rolled out, You have the same thing with, of course, the bureaucracy, who don't want to have, because there's so many levels of management now. Just think about Elon Musk. He fired 90% of Twitter employees. Is now working more effectively than ever. I'm not trying to equate the NHS with Twitter, but the levels of managerial bureaucracy that exist there. The great problem, of course, is that Labour, being the party of the NHS, can't go where it needs to be going with reform, and that's to look at the whole idea of free at the point of service. I have always supported that. I still have an emotional attachment to it, so long as it's working. If in Sweden has a much better healthcare system than we do. They also have free at the point of service. If we had Sweden's model, I'd still be in favour of it, but we don't have it. Something is broken. If you can reform the NHS and keep free at the point of service, fine. But if you can't, then that needs to be addressed. I don't want anybody to pay to go to the doctor, but if you go to the doctor and you miss your appointment, I want you to be fined. It also turns out every day 45,000 people go to the doctor to get aspirin and paracetamol for free, rather than paying £1 or £2 at Boots for it. That's the sort of thing you can get changes in. But, in Norway, they have, no one would say Norway is like America, because people often think, oh, well, you want some American system. In Norway, everything is free if you're under 16 or you're retired or you're pregnant. Everybody else has to pay user fees. But once you get to £250, everything over that is free. That seems pretty fair and decent. And then you have to, Germany and the Swiss, they all have their own models. South Korea has the world's #1 health system. It's ranked #1 in the OECD. And in South Korea, if you can't afford healthcare, you get it for free. If you can afford, then you're expected to have some sort of health insurance. And again, it's not that different to actually what comes out of your pay packet for taxes at the end of the day. But there's the incentive, because you're paying for it, that you actually use the system much better.
Do you think as well, do you think that what happened during COVID, really the scales did fall from a lot of people's eyes, in the sense that the NHS here kind of just shut up shop, didn't it? On also when it really didn't need to. It just stopped all sorts of treatments, and people have looked and said, well, actually, why did that happen? Why was that necessary?
Yeah, and I don't think it's fully recovered. I know a lot of people that still have appointments over the phone now, and that wasn't really the dumb thing before COVID. But now a lot of GPs still do that. And you're right. Before COVID, there were about 3 million people waiting for routine appointments. Post-COVID, there's now 7.5 million people waiting for routine appointments. So it's more than doubled because of COVID. And this is the big issue that neither of the political parties will talk about, because they were both responsible for it. They both believed in lockdown, and they both believed in, save the NHS and everything. And I always think it's so, I don't know, when you see those stickers that are sometimes still left on the streets of NHS in a big heart.
I love the NHS.
I love the NHS. You just realise how dystopian and how propagandistic it became, and how almost Soviet it became. It was really something to behold. And I do think people have become disillusioned with it, because just getting a GP appointment now is very different to how it was even 10 years ago.
Yes, it was an ideological tool. The NHS was used as an ideological tool to keep us in our homes. But the really shocking thing is when you think about this on a very personal level, and everybody has these stories, don't they, about how the NHS has failed them. And I'm one of those people. My father would have had a much more comfortable last few weeks of his life if the NHS had diagnosed him properly and hadn't completely failed him. There's a sense then that we might want to say, as a temporary measure, rather than saying that we love the NHS. Alison Pearson again was saying this. She said, I hate the NHS until something is done about it. The problem is nothing is ever going to be done about it, because it is that ideological tool, and it's needed by the people who are in charge and who actually run the thing.
This might seem like heresy, but we started by talking about how the fact that only Labour can sort of say this sort of thing about the NHS. Well, perhaps that's a good thing. Do you know? Because if any Tory said this, they immediately say, you just want to privatise it.
Yeah.
So as soon as you say reform, at least, they can take any flack they get, Starmer and his crew, but essentially it's probably a good thing that it's them doing it, isn't it?
Well, it's funny, actually, say what you want. No one's been a bigger critic of Tony Blair and New Labour than I have, but actually you have to say when the New Labour was in power, in terms of our infrastructure, was a major problem with the Tories as well, is all the money's been going to pay rises, 22% as well now with Labour for junior doctors, nobody investing in capital infrastructure and funds, so the buildings are collapsing everywhere, everyone's getting these pay rises. Under Labour, actually, they were actually doing considerably decent reforms, and the quality of healthcare, cancer levels, everything was actually improving under Labour. Just the same way that deportations under Tony Blair, legal migration was one thing, opening the doors to mass immigration, but far higher levels of deportation under Tony Blair's New Labour than under the Tories. And Tony Blair had serious discussions about deporting to Tanzania, something which people in Labour don't seem to remember at all, So, yes, it actually can take the Labour Party to actually take those steps that our ineffectual Tories today are too weak on, although I'm sure that, Thatcher would have been quite happy to take those unions to task like she did the miners.
Yes, obviously with... when Boris Johnson was here during COVID, it was all our NHS, wasn't it? Our NHS. So obviously sort of propagandizing it and everything, but I don't think people believe that for a minute. Well, look, we have just a few minutes for our members' exclusive content. So we're going to be carrying on, but otherwise, that's it for this week. Thank you so much, Rafe. Thanks, Amy. Thank you, Philip. And look, have a good week, won't you? And we shall see you next time. And don't forget those local states. Goodbye.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.